So welcome back from spring break. It's great to see you all back. You're booing me. I'm sorry that I'm not spring break. Welcome back. As noted in the syllabus, you're expected to return both physically and mentally from spring break, and I can see from the hungry looks on your faces that you've done exactly that. You've come back and you're ready to learn, you're ready for knowledge, you want to be educated, you're passionate about social psychology, and that's something I admire about every one of you. So I'm impressed, I'm glad to see these looks on your faces. Every one of you is looking at me right now with this sullen look that this is not how you actually feel inside. But I know you better, and I know that you feel the passion, and we're going to get going. And we're going to channel that. I, too, am passionate about the rest of this semester. I think a lot of the best stuff, my favorite stuff to teach in this class starts in this kind of last third of the class. So this is going to be a good part of the class. Where we left off, we were sort of in the middle of a social psychological journey, an odyssey, if you will. And where we had started with some classical psychological social psychology in the first third of the class. Some of the classic stuff that people think of when they think of social psychology: conformity, cognitive biases, cognitive dissonance, balance theory, some great work. And we went from there, from that relatively individual level stuff, a lot of it older research, to more sociological stuff, more social psychological research about social interaction, groups, how people interact with groups, and so on. And so that's where we are now, and we're sort of finishing up that third of the class, the second third of the class. And then in the third third of the class, which will start next Thursday, we're going to come back down in levels of analysis. We're going to leave groups not behind, but we're going to focus more on the individual again. And we're going to try and confront some kind of fundamental questions about the human condition, like what does it take to be happy? What does it take to maintain good relationships? And these sorts of questions. How can you find the good life? How can you find satisfaction in everyday life? And social psychology is very much the science of everyday life. A lot of areas profess to study this in the social sciences. I think that social psychology is the place to go for the greatest observations about everyday life, the determinants of human behavior, human attitudes, perception. And so in a lot of ways, I think this is the work that is most applicable to your everyday life. So right now, what we're doing is we're finishing this middle third, where the work, the research that we're talking about, and the theories we're talking about are as social as it's going to get throughout this class. And indeed, we've gotten pretty high in levels of analysis. It's gotten pretty social. So when we left for spring break, we had talked about different levels of identity. We talked about personal identities, which we don't cover in the class. But we talked about role identities. We talked about the Zimbardo prison experiment. We talked about the work of Irving Goffman. And then we went up in levels of analysis from that even to social identity theory and intergroup conflict. And you watched The Grand Illusion and got some greater understanding on the dynamics of groups that are brought together, the Robbers Cave experiment. And so now you have some sense of individuals in relationship to their groups. I mean, not that you didn't before, but hopefully some greater sense. Then, right before break, in an extremely well-attended lecture that all of you were here for, we talked about culture. Culture is a big concept. It's a big group concept. We think of whole nations or even continents as having cultures. And we talked about one of the fundamental areas of research on culture in social psychology, the Southern culture of honor. And the Southern culture of honor lecture, I'll recap it briefly, was oriented towards a solution to a problem. And that problem was, why is it, problem isn't a research problem, not necessarily a social problem, though most would probably argue it is a social problem. And that problem was, why is it the case that Southern white males are more violent than Northern white males, and at such high rates? And it's a big difference that we find in systematic research on this subject. And the Southern culture of honor, as a theory, located one factor as the answer to this question, and that factor is cultures of honor, that there is a culture of honor in the South which says that when your honor is threatened or challenged, or the honor of your family or people you care about, that you're supposed to defend your honor with violence if necessary. And that they did a series of studies showing that in the South, or Southern men, when challenged, are more likely to fly off the handle or get very angry or get very, very violent, more so than northern white males. And we also found that southern white males are also higher in politeness, but those politeness norms in the South may actually strangely contribute in a counterintuitive way, an ironic way, to these high rates of violence. And so that's the lecture that I left you with 2 Thursdays ago. And since then, if you're anything like me, I spent 8 of 11 days sitting on the couch, eating 7-layer dip. I went through several 7-layer dips, and each more satisfying than the last. And I recharged my jets. I had many beers. I watched many college basketball games. But at this point, I got a question: is that life fulfilling? You know, can you just eat 7-layer dip for the rest of your life? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think Seth Rogen's doing a film on that right now. But so I tried that, and I came away with a greater appreciation for what we're doing here, and so I'm excited to get back started on the next topic, which has nothing to do with guacamole or any of that. Okay. Oh, one organizational thing before we start today's lecture. The exam is next Tuesday for the second third of the class. So on Thursday, we're going to do a review for that. We're going to review all the material that will be on the second exam, and then I'll probably have a review sheet up by late Wednesday night, if not earlier. So any questions about that coming exam? Okay. It should be a lot like the first one. Yes, ma'am. Am I going to hand out the, yes, I will bring paper copies of the review sheet to class on Thursday, so you can print it or not print it, either way. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, great. And then also after class today, we'll be handing back any copies of exams you haven't picked up yet outside of, out front of Valley here. Okay. So, as I said, we're in the middle of the middle third, or at the end of the middle third of the class. And in this part, we've been talking a lot about sociological concepts and ideas and theories. And specifically today, I want to talk about research on status, or theory and research on status. And status is a central sociological concept that's earned a great deal less attention in psychology, though more recently psychologists have made some very nice contributions to this area, including our own Dr. Keltner and Cameron Anderson on this campus. So status is a fundamental area that sociologists are interested in, partly because it goes back to Max Weber. Max Weber was this early sociologist, maybe the first sociologist in some ways. Well, I guess Auguste Comte was probably the first sociologist, but he's kind of the first person that contributes a great deal of information to cutting-edge contemporary sociology. And he was one of the first people to say the fundamental dimensions of stratification and inequality in everyday life and also in greater societies are, do you know what they are? Class, status, and power. Exactly. Very good. And so today we'll be focused on status, and we'll be very much following the Weberian tradition, following his conception of status, though we'll be focused, because we're social psychologists, at a somewhat lower level of analysis. Okay. So what is status? Well, as I start the definition of what status is, I want to point out that groups tend to divide into relative hierarchies based on status. And this is an observation that was made it's been made several times in human history, I'm sure, but it was made in the early 1950s by Robert Bales, a professor at Harvard, who you might remember was the main person responsible for denying Stanley Milgram tenure at Harvard. So they didn't get along very well. And this is an observation that was made based on research on small groups. They would observe these small groups in artificial laboratory settings and just watch what they did. And what they found was that spontaneously, even groups of total strangers, when thrown together into a room and asked to interact and directed in their interaction toward, can you all please be quiet there? You. Thank you. And being directed in their interaction towards some task, they would very quickly form hierarchies of status and influence. This would happen spontaneously. And it's just a fundamental tendency of human nature to divide into status hierarchies, relative hierarchies. So, what's the definition of status for the purposes of this class? Status is an individual's relative standing in a group's hierarchy based on prestige, honor, and respect. You know, the first rule of definitions is don't use the term in the definition. And so we've craftily gotten around that by using these synonyms, prestige, honor, and respect. I could have just said status equals prestige, honor, and respect, but I decided to throw in an individual's relative standing in a group hierarchy to kind of clarify some of the dynamics of status. This is my definition. This is, if you're frustrated with this, you should blame Morris E. Zeldich Jr. I know. Actually, his nickname is Buzz, partly because that's, I don't know. Anyway, we'll get back to Morris E. Zeldich Jr. soon. Okay, so your position in a status hierarchy reflects essentially how good people think you are. You know, not good in the moral sense, but good in terms of your value. Remember back to the Grand Illusion film that we watched in the lecture that accompanied it, we were talking about how people in feudal times were born into positions of nobility or commoner, and those were status positions. And people thought that the nobles were better by birth, that upon being born, they were better people. And likewise, status, though it's not determined by birth in our society anymore, I mean, maybe a little bit, race, gender, and so on, but it's largely not based on inherent, innate characteristics. Instead, it's mostly achieved now, or believed to be achieved, based on fair or unfair criteria, but it still reflects this idea of how good people think you are. How honorable are you? How much do people respect you? Okay. Now, these hierarchies, these status hierarchies in groups, these relative hierarchies, are the product of all status-relevant information that's available in some group setting. So when we go into a group setting, what we do is we obtain all the information that's relevant, that differentiates people with respect to status. And in a second, we'll talk about what kinds of information that is. What kind of information is considered status relevant in this culture, at least. And in these groups, we take that information, we kind of look around, size up the room, size up the group, maybe you're not in a room, whatever, size up the group, and say, where does everybody stand on these various criteria? Where does everybody stand in terms of their relative wealth, their gender, and so on? And we combine this information and create a sort of mental hierarchy of who's best and who isn't. So status characteristics are characteristics of individuals that are status relevant. So when I talk about status relevant information, or on the ensuing slides here, when I talk about bases of status stratification, what I'm talking about are status characteristics, characteristics of an individual that are considered status relevant. And information about these characteristics is combined to create a general sense of each person's position in the group's status hierarchy. Okay. So what are these bases of status differentiation? You probably have some idea already of criteria that separates people along status lines in our culture, but let's be explicit about it. What are some of these status characteristics? Well, they include, first, bases of discrimination in a larger society. And these will be some familiar criteria to you. So race, gender, sexual orientation, wealth, power, attractiveness. For all of these concepts, for all of these dimensions, people who are higher on them, and every one of you knows what I mean by higher on them. Everybody already says, oh, I know for race you mean white, at least in this culture. I know for gender you mean male. I know for sexual orientation you mean straight, and so on. For the more valued side of that characteristic, people are more respected, and people lower on those criteria tend to be discriminated against in society. And so these are among the bases of status discrimination in groups, or status differentiation in groups. When we go and size up everybody's standing in the group on this relative hierarchy, among the things we first attend to are their race, gender, and so on. But also, status hierarchies aren't only made up of these characteristics, these bases of discrimination, they're also made up of more merit-based factors that more directly reflect perceived levels of competence, or maybe your moral fiber or virtue, if you will. And these include education. So people with more education are more respected. That's why we're all here, presumably. Specific skills, intelligence, generosity or honesty. Again, these kind of bases of moral fiber or integrity. We respect people more who are more generous or who are more honest. So, again, when we're sizing up the groups we're in and putting together a mental relative hierarchy in our heads, we're taking into account all this information. We say, well, Joe is a white male, but he's also very honest. he's low in education, he has these skills, he doesn't have these skills, and he's you know, a moderately smart guy. You know, Jane is a black woman, she's extremely well educated, she's very smart, and she's generous, and she's incredibly dishonest, or so, I don't know, whatever. And you put this together in a mental hierarchy, and you sort of combine all these things, and that's how you assess where people stand with respect to status. What's an example of a fair criteria? These are intended to be, I mean, you don't want to say, you know, it's hard to say what's fair. Certain people would say, from certain cultural backgrounds or with certain attitudes would say gender. That's a fair criteria of status differentiation because men are inherently better than women or women are inherently better than men. I'm here saying that's a basis of discrimination most of us would agree is not a fair basis of status differentiation. These are something more merit-based, more having to do with characteristics of your personality that are generally thought to be positively valued, or behaviors you've enacted that are generally thought to be positively valued, less categories you fit in that have generalizations attached to them that don't really have much to do with merit. So that would be these kind of bases of discrimination, and these are more what I'm calling more merit-based bases of status differentiation. So how generous you are, how intelligent you're perceived to be, and so on. But some people could say, generosity is for suckers. I don't respect people who are more generous. I respect people more selfish or something. Or somebody else might say, education, they got those hoity-toity people in Berkeley getting their bachelor's degrees. I don't respect these people, you know, and so on. So in this way, and again, I should step carefully saying fair and unfair, but in this way, broadly speaking, we could say that status hierarchies are based on both fair and unfair criteria. And indeed, status hierarchies also, not only do they reflect characteristics that we would all probably agree are merit-based, but then also ones that we would all agree are bases of discrimination, but then in turn, they have good and bad effects as well. So we often think, as sociologists, of status hierarchies as all bad. You know, they're just bases of discrimination. They just lead to some people being left out and some people being treated badly and other people being treated better for no good reason. But there's a whole other perspective on status hierarchies that says that's not the case. So yes, it is the case that status hierarchies lead to patterns of discrimination, and we would generally think of these as bad. But status hierarchies also streamline interaction and can help coordinate group action. So let's say, for example, that we have a work group, and it is the case that Jane is way more skilled at the task we're working on, and then there's 4 guys in the group who lack those skills. And it's widely known that Jane is by far the most skilled person in the room. What we would hope would happen is that people would defer to Jane's greater expertise on this task. And indeed, if that happens, perhaps as a result of status processes directing people to respect and defer to higher status people, then the group is going to be more productive. If they don't pay attention to Jane and instead ignore her contributions or treat them as equal to everybody else's, then what you'll find is that the group will do worse. It'll be less productive, less efficient, and so on. So in some ways, status hierarchies can be very useful for sort of coordinating and streamlining group action by saying, okay, we'll pay most attention to the highest status people who have the best inputs on this task and so on, and we'll defer to them, and then the people lower status will be quiet. Now, obviously, whether or not status is having good or bad effects, whether it's leading to unwarranted discrimination or whether it's leading to greater group productivity, streamlined interaction, and group coordination, will have a lot to do with whether that status hierarchy is based on the more merit-based or the more discriminatory bases of status. So, for example, if we have a group hierarchy that's really, you know, where people are mostly differentiated based on their skills, education, intelligence, generosity, and so on, then we're probably going to be like, oh, this status hierarchy rocks. It helps us work well as a group, and any discrimination it leads to is justified because generous, intelligent people, you know, deserve to be respected. But if our status hierarchy is based mostly on bases of discrimination, like race, gender, sexual orientation, wealth, class background, and so on, then we'll say, then it's probably not going to help the group do any better because these are bases of status differentiation that don't have much to do with real competence, and it's not going to help coordinate group action in a productive way, but it will lead to discrimination. So status hierarchies are in this way complicated. Just write that on your essay question. Okay. Okay, so what does status do? Higher status standing leads to greater respect from others, almost by definition, right? I put respect in the definition of status, and then I said status caused respect. You should be very suspicious of It leads to greater influence. People who are higher status in groups tend to have more influence over other people, more influence over the outcomes of group decision making. If I'm in a room with someone who I really, really respect, who's a lot higher status than me, I'll probably defer to them. And likewise, they will not be influenced by me because relative to them, I'm very low status. Also, higher status people are given more opportunities to speak. Have you ever had this experience where you're in a group, you think you know the right answer, but you happen to be low status for reasons you probably don't buy into? Because people rarely do when they're low status. Well, that's not necessarily good. But anyway, imagine one of those situations where you don't buy the bases for why you're low status. Nobody's listening to you. Nobody's giving you any opportunities to speak, but you think you know the right answer. We've all been there. Also, higher status standing tends to lead to one's ideas, contributions to group efforts, thoughts that people express, as it tends to lead to them being more positively evaluated. So even if we were to somehow experimentally control for how smart your contributions in a group interaction are, if you're high status, people will be like, that's some smart stuff. That is really well done, well done. You always seem to get it right. But if you're low status, people will be like, well, you know, I don't think you've really thought about all sides of the issue, and so on. Even if you said the exact same thing in these two settings, if your status level is different, your contribution, or what you said, will often be differently evaluated. And again, we should all be able to think of circumstances like that where we're in a position where there's some boss or something like that that everybody respects, and they say something that's just inane, you know, that's just idiotic, and you're like, wow, that's just really dumb. And then you find maybe even yourself saying, yeah, that's okay, that's great, we'll come back to that, that's really kind of okay. When you should be saying, that doesn't make any sense at all. But if they were low status, you might challenge them. And indeed, really high status people, they almost seem to have an aura where you can't really criticize them for concerns about retribution from others and just seeming like your own position in the group is illegitimate. Okay, other stuff that higher status leads to, higher perceived competence. This is about the same thing. When people are higher status, we tend to assume they're more competent. Traditionally, throughout American history, whites and males have been thought of as more competent, even when there was no reason to assume that. Higher perceived honesty and integrity. This is very interesting. They have lots of research showing that higher status people will get sentenced to fewer years because they're, you know, when they go up for sentencing, if they've been found guilty, partly because they're assumed to be more honest, have greater integrity. They found, by the way, that attractive people will get sentenced to fewer years in prison for the exact same crime, same details of the crime. And they think this is because attractiveness leads to status, leads to presumptions of honesty and integrity. And indeed, this is one thing that is the case. More attractive people are more honest and have greater integrity. Just checking. Every once in a while, you got to check. So, higher status people tend to get better pay in labor markets. They tend to be assigned greater pay. And then they also, and this is kind of frustrating should you not be super high status in general, they tend to be held to more lenient standards of evaluation. So high status people, it's hard for them to lose their status because when they do things, people say, oh, you know, like that's pretty good, and they hold them to a lower standard of evaluation. Whereas if you're low status and you're trying to improve your standing in some group, you're held to a very tough standard. And your contributions are evaluated more critically. And you can think back now to this example I was talking about where you imagine you're in some group setting and the highest status person says something dumb. What happens? Are they held to the toughest standard that anybody's argument would be held to? Are they called inane? Is their argument ridiculed? No, not the highest status person, very rarely. If they were the lowest status person, then maybe that would happen. Okay, so having talked about some of these things that status is based on, some of these bases of discrimination it's based on, as well as more merit-based criteria of status standing in groups, and then also having talked about some of the things that status causes, let's talk about some of the principles or processes of status. Like, how does status work? And this is something that social psychologists are very interested in. And they don't think quite as much about the first two things that we talked about. They think more about these processes by which status works. This is what really gets social psychologists excited. So first, status hierarchies are relative. Now, what does that mean? People are always saying this in social psychology, and a lot of people don't appreciate how profound this observation about status hierarchies is. Well, the idea here is that you're ranked relative to others around you in your group. So Your status standing is contingent on characteristics of yourself, maybe your education, your race, your gender, maybe your honesty, generosity, and so on, but it's also contingent on the people around you. So there is a group setting where you could be easily the highest status person in the group, right? There's definitely a group setting like that. In fact, you may have been in that group setting today. You might be in that group setting in this room, I don't know. And there's also a group setting where you can be the lowest status person in the group. And indeed, you're probably often in groups like that. Think about those of you who have children and also have parents. Think about when you go to your parents' house and your child isn't with you. Then you are a child, right? And you're the lowest status person in the house or in the home. But then you go back home to your kids, and then all of a sudden you're the highest status person. You're a very different person, right? In terms of how you're treated, the way you enact yourself in these different settings. From a certain perspective, you're the same person, but from a social psychological perspective, you're a very different person. You've been high status, you've been low status. Think about your progress throughout the course of a day. You know, you sit in this room and you're lower status, and then you leave, maybe talking to the person next to you, you're equal status probably. Then you go into some room, maybe you lead some student group, your highest status. Then you go into another room with another group that maybe you live with, and you're equal status. Or maybe you then go to some other student organization where you're new at, and you're the lowest status person. And you maybe epiphenomenally in your head experience all these settings and experience yourself in all these settings as the same person. And certainly, in a certain sense, you are the same person. But in a very social sense, you're a very, very different person. And you've occupied very different roles and status positions across these groups. And I think this is one of the great observations that status research has given us, is the relative nature of status hierarchies. I have a friend, my friend Bob, I was talking to him one time. My friend Bob was this good friend of mine from college. I should clarify at the beginning of this that in high school and college, I was someone that none of you would hang out with. Like, none of you would have been caught dead with me. And I was talking with Bob about how, like, not, you know, popular we were in high school. And I was like, but I did very well with the dorks, though, you know? Like, I was good with the dorks. And my friend Bob got all excited, and he's like, oh, I was the king of the dorks, you know? And I was like, I'll bet you were, Bob. I bet you were. And Bob was the king of the dorks. And you knew it. You knew it as soon as you met him. And I love Bob. He's a beautiful guy. So, and if you've ever seen the movie Freaks and Geeks, you know, like we would fit right in there with the geeks, maybe the freaks as well. But anyway, if you've ever seen that, we were the kind of guys. We were on the AV club, you know, debate club, academic teams, and math club, mathletes, all of that. Loved that stuff. Loved it. Loved it. And perhaps, because in those settings we could actually find respect. And that's the point, though. We would walk from those rooms, you know, to other rooms, and our respect would plunge, you know, plunge. And so Bob, in one room, could be king of the dorks, and in another room could be very looked down upon, and a social outcast, a pariah, really a pariah. Yeah. Okay, so the exact same person could be low status in one setting with the popular kids or with wealthy people, but high in another with nerdy kids or poor people. Think about the wealthiest person you know, the wealthiest person you've ever met in your entire life. And, you know, usually probably in group settings with this person, they were high status or maybe even the highest status in whatever groups you were in because of their wealth and their background and so on. But think also for a second that there's a room that they could go in, there's a group that they could be in, and indeed they've probably been in this group where they're the lowest status person, where their wealth actually isn't that high, right, where it's much lower. And there you have it. There you have the relative nature of status hierarchies, that even the wealthiest person you know somewhere is low status or even lowest status in a group due to their wealth being too low. That would be a room, you know, or a group they would be in with even more wealthy people. And indeed, we think that wealth affects people's interpretation of how wealthy they are has a lot to do with relative status, right? That people, they could feel poorer when their neighbor next door gets a bigger SUV than them, and they feel like they don't make as much money. They feel like their class status has somehow gone down. Likewise, we could all go to a third world country, and many of you probably have been to third world countries, and there you're incredibly wealthy. So likewise, you could have apparently high status characteristics, but be low status in a certain group. And that's the puzzle of country clubs. Why do wealthy white males hang out in country clubs where they're actually not high status? You'd think they'd hang out with people that they were higher status than, but I guess the scotch is really good there. So in one day, a person could occupy many status levels. This is actually a famous photograph that I just threw in here, which I think illustrates the relative nature of class and status really well. It's by Alfred Stieglitz. Does anybody know who Alfred Stieglitz was married to? Oh, I heard somebody whisper it. Exactly, Georgia O'Keeffe, the great painter. And Alfred Stieglitz was a photographer and one of the first sort of artistic photographers, and he did this painting, or sorry, this photograph called steerage. So what's steerage? Does anybody know what steerage is? That's right. Sort of the lower class cargo space in a ship. And it would be down here as the steerage area. And so he's directing your attention to there. But also, notice that central in this picture are two things that the light is sort of catching and are illuminated. One, this gangplank that's arced up like this that goes up to the higher class section of the boat. And then also this man's hat, which looks down into the steerage section. And maybe this woman's robe as well. So this is a great photograph that illustrates the class hierarchy and also the relative nature of status. Okay. So what are some other things that we think we know about status and status processes? What are some other things that we think we know? Well, another thing that we think we know about how status works, status processes, is that status, bases of status, status characteristics, are culturally determined. Now, what am I talking about when I say that? What I mean is that different cultures and different historical periods, different societies essentially, will develop different criteria for status differentiation and status stratification. They'll develop a different sense of what are legitimate status characteristics, what are legitimate bases to say, we'll respect this person more than this person. And you may have seen this, I mean, when you watch old movies, right, like you get this insight on this, that American culture used to assign greater status advantage to men, right? Men and women are now much more equal in status in this country and in this culture, right? Women are now the majority of the workforce, the majority of the undergraduate college population. But to people who lived 50 years ago, this is an amazing cultural transition. This would have been hard to anticipate 50 or 60 years ago, that the gender gap in status would be closed as much as it has been. Likewise, racial status differences, we believe, have closed a great deal. I mean, if you think back, we had school desegregation just 50, 55 years ago, and now we don't, and indeed status differences have closed somewhat since then, although we'll talk later in this lecture about ways in which they haven't closed it nearly all the way. So, just in our own culture, we have this observation that status differences have closed over, or have changed over time, where we still have status differentiation, and we still have unequal status hierarchies, but maybe the bases and criteria of them change. So, one of the first scholars to identify the relative nature of status, of bases of status, was Friedrich Nietzsche. And he did this in a book, a classic work of philosophy called The Genealogy of Morals, which he published in 1887. And Nietzsche is somebody who we often make fun, like I'll make fun of Freud in this class a great deal. I've made fun of Heidegger, and I'll probably make fun of Nietzsche as well. And Nietzsche's kind of got it coming. I mean, you know, your sort of typical picture of Nietzsche is as this maligned, unpopular, pasty-faced man in his attic, you know, writing these philosophical tracts about Ubermensches and Superman and how there were these superior blonde beasts who ought to dominate and do what they will. And I think he imagined that he wanted to be one of these. He liked the might makes right sort of philosophy. And Nietzsche, you know, this doesn't sit well with current contemporary, you know, cultural sensibilities, and so, you know, we make fun of Nietzsche for this sometimes. But Nietzsche was also a great scholar and a great philosopher. And one thing that I think he really got right was this idea, and I feel like he was the first one to clearly enunciate it. And what he said was, the things that we consider meritorious, that we consider good, the things that make us respect one another, they change over time. And here he was going up against a dominant argument. I know you're thinking, boy, that's not shocking, but here, you have to understand the backdrop of this argument. This was in the 19th century in Europe, and at the time, there was a dominant sense that Christian values and Christian morals, whatever bases of respect they prescribe, have been ubiquitous across human history and are the natural, best ways to think of respect and morality and virtue. And Nietzsche went up to that and he said, no, they're not inevitable. There's nothing inherent in humans that makes them latch on to Christian values and morals. In fact, in different times, in different cultures, in different historical epochs, there have been different standards of morality, virtue, and goodness. So, he draws this big comparison between Romans and Christians. And of course, Christianity developed in large part as a cultural response to the morals and values that were inherent in ancient Rome. And he pointed out that the Roman idea of morality and the Roman idea of virtue and the Roman idea of what is deserving of respect is based on might, power, competence, excellence, achievement, skill, and so on. Power, whatever. I said power twice because I really meant power. And Nietzsche liked this one, right? This is the one that he liked. He wanted us to get back to this basis of respect, that we ought to respect great men, Übermensch, the Übermensch. That's what we should respect, the supermen. And to support this argument, he didn't just look at, ancient historical texts from Rome and say, hey, the Romans seem to respect, might and power and excellence. He also pointed out that the etymology of the word virtue comes from the Latin, the word virtue, which is essentially goodness and morality, right? That if you go back to the ancient Latin, what did virtue mean? Well, virtue had this whole other path linguistically and became our contemporary word virtuoso. And virtuoso is a window into what? Window. And it was a window. Mace Windu, Star Wars. I'm thinking about Star Wars, apparently, at some subconscious level. Purple lightsaber. So it was some insight. Okay, so virtuoso as a word, a contemporary word, and what it means gives us some insight on what the Romans thought virtue meant, because this word has been largely unchanged over time in terms of what it means. And what virtuoso is, somebody who's extremely skilled, extremely excellent, right? Like Michael Jordan or Bill Gates or Yo-Yo Ma. I mean, we could contest, whether or not, obviously Magic Johnson was a better basketball player than Michael Jordan. I know. Okay, Wilt Chamberlain, will you give me that? Dang, all right. Got some Michael Jordan lovers here. Okay. And we might contest, how great was Bill Gates or whatever. But in any event, these people have achieved high status due to their achievements, their excellence at what they do, perceived or real. So that's what virtue used to mean. When the ancient Romans talked about a virtuous, good, moral person, what they were talking about was somebody who was excellent and achieved great things. And then now, our culture is dominated more by a Christian conception of virtue, right? And even when we hear the word virtue, we don't think virtuoso, right? We think of virtue in a very Christian sense of a sort of pro-social person, a person who's good to others. Well, I can't even stop using the words good and virtue, right? Because I'm so stuck in the contemporary conception of virtue. But we mean now generosity, honesty, self-sacrifice, that sort of thing. And so a virtuous person... So virtue now might mean principled, ethical, chaste, and I think I actually wrote something beneath here you're not going to see. But that was good. This stuff down here was among the best stuff in the entire semester, which unfortunately you're going to miss that, but that was a knockout punch on this whole lecture, I swear to God. So now with the rise of Christianity and the rise and domination of Judeo-Christian ethics, which Nietzsche documents in the Genealogy of Morals, we now think of virtue as people who are good in a contemporary sense, generous, honest, principled, and so on, integrity, that sort of thing. Not achievement, not power, not might, maybe competence, but mostly these good things, looking after other people. And these examples were like a priest or a nun were the ones that he kept talking about, but you might imagine a relief worker or a Peace Corps person or a social worker as being someone who seems very virtuous. Those would be like secular versions. But Nietzsche was very focused on virtue being now a Judeo-Christian religious concept, and so he highlighted priests and nuns as classic examples of high virtue people in the contemporary culture. So Nietzsche makes a good case that over time and across cultures, that which is good, that which is moral, that which is virtuous has changed a great deal and will continue to change. It's something we've seen in our lifetime. It's something that he shows us has happened over the last 2,500 years, and it's hard to say that he's wrong because the evidence is strong. Okay, it's all coming out. Okay. All right, so that's, okay, all right. Next, another thing that we think we know about status, and this is a very controversial thing. Every time I teach this, people get kind of pissed off. And we can contest how much this is true, but this is a fundamental idea from status research that has a lot of research in support of it, and it is the idea that status beliefs, these bases of status differentiation, and status hierarchies in groups tend to be broadly shared. What do I mean by that? I mean that everybody in a given culture tends to have the same ideas about what is meritorious and status relevant and what the status characteristics are. Everybody in a culture tends to share their impression of that. Likewise, everybody in a group tends to agree on what the status hierarchy in that group is. Why? Because they're in the same culture. They have the same rules for how you put together the status relevant information. So when we all enter some group, we know that males are more respected, that whites are more respected, straight people are more respected, higher social class people are more respected. We also know that more intelligent people, more educated people are more respected. And we all put the status hierarchy together following the same rules. And in a second, we'll talk about a theory that sort of explains how those rules work. But one implication of this is that low status people will tend to believe their low status position is legitimate in the same way that high status people believe their high status position is legitimate. And that also people will tend to endorse larger status beliefs in the culture and in the society that maybe even disadvantage them. So what's an example of this? Okay, Goldberg 1968 is a classic example of this. In Goldberg 1968, this woman did an experiment where she was interested in whether men or women as authors, whether their texts would be evaluated more positively. And she found that if a text was identified as being authored by a woman, then it would be evaluated lower, that it would be seen as like not as good of a text. And remember I said that the things that higher status people say tend to be more positively evaluated, and the things that lower status people say tend to be more negatively evaluated. This is an example of that. Even if you write what you say and it's a text and people evaluate it, this will tend to be the case. So that isn't that amazing, right? We think we already know that higher status people, that the things they produce are more positively evaluated. The Goldberg observation was that both men and women exhibited this bias. It was the case that both men and women as raters, as people reading a text, tended to rate the exact same text as being higher quality, more insightful, a better text if it was authored by a man than if it was authored by a woman. This is a bit of a puzzle. Why would women endorse status beliefs that disadvantage them in the 60s or perhaps even now? It's a puzzle. But the point is that status beliefs are based on culturally legitimate beliefs that we all sort of share about what is meritorious. Now, you might think, no, I don't necessarily buy into that. Like, I don't just respect rich people more than poor people. Or I opt out of this one, or I opt out of that one. And these are status beliefs. This is generally the case. So maybe you're right that you're different. But generally it's the case that status beliefs are shared in a culture. Yes? Yes, internalized racism would be a good example, or a term for the race-specific example of this. And so we'll talk about that more. So the best example, or the earliest evidence for the internalization of race as a basis of status, internalized and accepted by even the disadvantaged group, would be the Kenneth and Mamie Clark doll experiments. Is anybody familiar with these experiments? Okay, cool. So in the Kenneth and Mamie Clark doll experiments, what they did was they went down to the Deep South. I believe it was all done in the Deep South. And they presented black children with white dolls and black dolls. And like the kind of dolls you play with when you're a kid. And asked them a series of questions, including which one's prettier, which one do you want to play with, and one of the big kickers is they asked them which one is better. So which one is better? Because remember, status is supposed to be about how good somebody is. And if these social psychologists are right, that status is that the bases of status differentiation in a society or in a culture are broadly shared and endorsed even by people who are disadvantaged by them, then we would expect black children in the Deep South in the 1950s to say the white doll is better. The white doll is better, it's prettier, and I'd rather play with it. And that's exactly what they found. Also, when asked to color themselves with crayons, they would color themselves as lighter, in a lighter shade than they actually were, which is very sad. So this research, the reason Kenneth and Mamie Clark did this research is they wanted to show that institutions of discrimination in the South, like school segregation, were having real damaging psychological effects on the people that were disadvantaged by them, by real damaging effects on African American children in the South. And so as a result, it was cited in the Brown versus the Board of Education decision in 1954, which desegregated the schools. So this was something that Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP cited as like, here is hard scientific evidence that there's damaging effects going on as a result of racial discrimination or racial segregation in the United States. Just a side note, Kenneth and Mamie Clark were the first and second African Americans to receive PhDs from Columbia. They received PhDs from Columbia University in psychology and passed away recently, a few years ago, which is too bad. They were real heroes of our discipline. So this observation that people tend to internalize and accept status beliefs that disadvantage them, even ones which they wouldn't necessarily intellectually agree with, but they nonetheless tend to internalize them and take them and believe them at some more fundamental level, was part of the impetus for the Black is Beautiful movement of the 1970s, which tried to reject these findings and sort of say, no, we're going to effortfully not believe this cultural message that we're not beautiful or we're not as good as these other people. And has anybody ever seen this film, A Girl Like Me? Raise your hand if you've seen it. This is really, really good. I advise, please, all of you go to YouTube and check out this video. It's really good, right? This is amazing. Because you might be saying right now, this couldn't happen today, right? This is something that happened in the early 1950s in the Deep South in the United States. And you know, you've read books, you've seen films about the Deep South in the early 1950s. I mean, it was a rough place, right? Like if you went down to desegregate schools, people would kill you, you know? And so you're thinking, wow, now what kind of relevance does that have to my world right now in the contemporary U.S. in the 21st century? Probably not much, right? Schools have been integrated for 40-some years. The status differences, we believe, have narrowed. We have a Black president. You know, this has got to be over, right? Well, you should watch A Girl Like Me, because this woman decided to replicate the Kenneth and Mamie Clark doll experiments about 2 years ago, and this documents the results she found. And basically the takeaway is that, yeah, she was able to replicate these findings, and they were essentially unchanged. Okay, so let's talk about a theory about status. Or actually, let's take like a 2 or 3 minute break, and we'll come back and talk about this theory about status. Better yet. 2 or 3 minutes, I know. You're booing and hissing already. That's good. Okay. Okay. Let's get class going. We'll get it started on a somewhat somber note, for we must now review this theory that was introduced at Stanford University in the 1960s. So upset. I'm so sorry to have done this. I know you just got back from spring break. You're trying to get excited about college, you know, and I want you to be excited about college here at this fine, the greatest public university in the history of humanity. and yet I'm here. And here I am talking about this other school, this local school. So we'll just call it that, the local school. Okay, so there was this theory developed at the local school in the 1960s by Joe Berger and company, and strangely, anomalously, given what we think we know about that place, it's a very, very good theory. This theory describes status processes in groups very well. And a lot of the things that I've been describing to you, like how people take status characteristics and status-relevant information and combine them in their heads in order to create relative status hierarchies, that's described by this theory. Likewise, the relative nature of status is something that's captured well by this theory. So let's talk about this theory, which supposedly captures status dynamics and how they work in groups very well. Well, status characteristics theory asserts that observable characteristics that differentiate group members, things like age, gender, race, several of these characteristics I've already been talking to you about, that they're differently valued in a culture. We all sort of know in a culture which one is higher status than the other. You know, we think we all know that males tend to be more respected than females, perhaps less so than before, but that gap is not closed all the way. That whites are more respected than members of minority races. And so they're differentially valued in a culture. They generate differential expectations of competency for group members. That the more respected category tends to lead to expectations of competence. So we expect men to be more competent, for example, in a committee meeting or in a group task. And then in consequence, as a result of that, it leads to a hierarchical distribution of participation and influence across members of the group. So in a group, we all sort of say, what are the observable characteristics that differentiate people? How are they valued in this culture we're all in? And then, yes, these more higher status people will tend to be expected to be more competent. They're seen as more competent. And then in turn, they'll be asked to participate more. They will themselves volunteer to participate more in groups. And then they'll have more influence over the other group members. And when I say participation, I don't mean like being in a walkathon or something. I mean like actually speaking in groups, you know, actually partaking in the conversation, saying more than the other people in the group, and so on. Okay. They argue that there's two types of status characteristics, diffuse and specific. Diffuse status characteristics are attributes that are believed to provide an indirect indication of a member's level of ability on the group's task, but typically are bases of discrimination in larger society, and the kind of things we would think of as probably not merit-based ways to sort the status hierarchy. So example of these are race and gender. I keep using these examples, and they are probably the dominant examples in our culture. Then they also talk about specific status characteristics. And these are attributes that are more directly and precisely indicate someone's level of ability on the group's tasks. So knowledge of history, if we're working on like a history student project, would be a specific status characteristic. Or if we're this is an absurd image. If we're all trying to fix a broken car, that would be weird. I can't imagine how that would happen. That might be like a weird dream you had. In that group, greater knowledge of cars, greater mechanical ability would be more respected. So there's a group setting where, you know, mechanical knowledge would be a very high status, would be the high status specific status characteristic, and another one where there's knowledge of history. So these are context specific characteristics, specific status characteristics. However, what they found in research on this theory is that specific status characteristics that are relevant to a task have a lot of influence on who we defer to, who participates more, who has influence, and so on, right? Like I said, if we're repairing a car and a mechanic's in the group, we're going to defer a lot to him or her, right? But also, specific status characteristics that are not relevant to the task also influence rates of participation and influence in the group. So it's the case that if I knew you were very skilled at math and we're working on a history project, the sheer fact that I know of some really high skills you have will tend to lead me to defer to you more, even if they're not directly relevant to the task at hand. And indeed, that's kind of one of the great contributions of status characteristics theory, is explaining that, yes, it's the case that a relevant basis of knowledge or skill in a domain has a lot of influence on status differentiation in the group, but even the stuff that's irrelevant to the task, specific skills in other domains, or your race or gender, they also influence status hierarchies. Okay. Status characteristics theory is a very fancy pants scientific theory and therefore has scope conditions. What are the scope conditions? What are scope conditions? They're the domain, general statements of the domain of application of a theory. So for example, water boils at, 212 Fahrenheit or something like that? Or 100 degrees Celsius, we'll say that. It boils at 100 degrees Celsius, but given certain scope conditions, this is the case, right? It has to be at sea level, for example. So these are scope conditions for this theory to work. This theory works if these scope conditions are realized, and it probably won't work or might not work if they aren't. So this theory is specific to groups that are working on some task and who are collectively oriented. So it would only apply to groups who are trying to do something together and are collectively oriented means they're taking into account everybody's opinion and sort of paying some attention to the group. They are essentially a real group trying to do something. That's the scope of application of this theory. And status characteristics theory says that status characteristics that differentiate group members affect status hierarchies even when they're unrelated to the group's task. That's what I was just saying is a big contribution of this theory. And the theory also predicts how diffuse and specific status characteristics combine to create the hierarchies in the groups. So it actually has this very specific mathematical formula for, okay, this is the weight that's attached to diffuse status characteristics, and this is the weight that's attached to specific status characteristics that are not related to the task at hand, and this is the weight that's attached to the ones that are related to the task at hand. And they put it into an equation, and they say, what are the number of people in the group, and they generate predictions for rates of influence in the group. And these predictions are, for rates of participation and influence in the group, are actually really, really accurate, and it's kind of an amazing example of a sociological theory that makes really accurate and specific predictions in group settings. We generally talk about tendencies and so on. Well, this is a theory that actually makes these very specific claims and predictions. So, having presented all that, some of these general ideas, these theoretical ideas that we think we know about status, let's talk about some research. Because if you're anything like me, you want to see real empirical research, evidence for these ideas. So let's see some of that. Or actually, not all of this research will be evidence for these ideas. Some of this research will also just cue you into new ideas that are also interesting about status. So does anybody know who this is? I don't have any idea why you would. This is Michael Lavallia. You've been reading some of his work in the class, and this is Michael Lavallia. He was my undergraduate advisor. So when I was where you were, he was where I am, and isn't that a weird little perspective thing that I just did? Okay. So Lavallia wrote an article. I remember when I was an undergraduate and I was a sophomore, I walked into his office and wanted to talk to him about research and stuff, like many of you walk into my office, and except it was more interesting than the experiences that you probably have when you walk into my office. But Lavallia is a very, very exciting, interesting person. Like he's kind of bubbling with ideas all the time. And I was asking him, like, what are you working on? And he's like, well, we're working on a project now. We're trying to bust the bell curve. And I was like, wow, what the heck does that mean? And what it means was Lavallia and a set of researchers that he assembled were interested in offering another perspective on the phenomenon that's documented in the book, The Bell Curve. So how many of you are familiar with this book, The Bell Curve? And how many of you are familiar with the Berkeley Sociology Department's rebuke to The Bell Curve, the book Inequality by Design? Okay, cool. So Inequality by Design was a sociological effort to rebuke the bell curve. We can talk about that sometime. But a rebuttal that came from social psychology came from Lavallia and colleagues. By the way, his name is Lavallia, and on the first day of his big lecture class, he's like, Lavallia, my name is Lavallia. It's pronounced like, hopefully by the end of this class, I'll Lavallia. Which is, I don't know, it's cute. I don't have anything like that for you guys. Yeah. And then, I know, it's pretty damn funny. Okay. So, the bell curve was this piece of psychology research that attributed lower test scores by African Americans in the United States to innate biological inferiority. It went to great pains to document that African Americans have traditionally scored lower on standardized tests like the SAT, and then makes the conclusion that this is best attributable to African Americans' biological inferiority relative to whites. So Lavoie walked up to this, and he was very suspicious of this finding, as were a lot of social scientists who know about patterns of discrimination, unequal opportunity in the United States, and think first about those things when they see unequal outcomes. So Lavoie walked up to this research, and he said, maybe these effects aren't driven by innate biological differences, which the writers of the bell curve never document in any rigorous way anyway. Maybe instead, status differences are responsible for these differences. And we know that African Americans tend to be respected less in American culture, and so maybe that has something to do with it. And specifically, Lavoie said, maybe if we made status differences, knowledge of status differences, salient in some setting, as in salient is like, make it active in people's minds, remind people of this information, maybe then low status individuals, just in general, regardless of their race or gender or whatever, just any low status individual will perform worse on a test. Worse than their high-status counterparts. And so that was his take on it. He's like, I think this is about status. I think it's because there's these cultural beliefs that African Americans will achieve at a lower level. Those cultural beliefs become a self-fulfilling prophecy when they're made active in some setting. And so if you're thinking about this, you'll tend to perform worse, or perform better if you're in the higher status group. And so that was his take. And then he's like, well, how do you test this? Because what the bell curve people did was they just documented a difference between whites and African Americans and then said it's biological inferiority. So Lavoie could offer the same documentation and then say it's status, but it wouldn't be any better evidence for his argument than the bell curve people had offered. There'd still be all these other explanations. And indeed, the bell curve people would have come back and said, no, we looked at the same evidence and said it was biological inferiority. What's your case? So what he said was, well, here's the way I should do it. What I should do is create some basis of status difference in a lab environment that doesn't exist anywhere else, that doesn't have any explanation for difference. In fact, it's totally irrelevant to the task at hand, totally irrelevant to performance on standardized tests. If I can just create that and imbue it with status beliefs in a lab session and maybe then create a test score gap, it would be proof that status differences can create test score gaps. And then we know there's a status difference in the dominant culture between whites and African Americans, so it doesn't take a genius to put 2 and 2 together. If there's a status difference in the larger culture, and then status differences are sufficient to create a test score gap, even when ability is the same, then he's made a good case that maybe the test score gap in the United States is attributable to status differences, not biological inferiority. So, or inferiority / superiority, whatever. So what he did was he identified a characteristic that was unrelated to status in the study population, or really in any population. He did a pretest, and he found that people in general think left and right-handed people are equal status. Now, this is ironic because we all know that right-handed people are biologically superior to left-handed people. So, by the way, my mom is left-handed, and she actually convinced my father that like half the presidents were left-handed, because my dad was always giving her, anyway, I don't know, cute little insight on my family. Okay, let's talk about lightsabers. Okay, so status research continued. Okay, so in one condition, so he took handedness. He was like handedness. People don't really have beliefs about who's higher or lower status with respect to handedness, except for my father. And what he did was, in one condition, he told participants that left-handers were better at this particular logic test. The logic test was, I believe, the Raven progressive matrices logic test. And in the other condition, he said that right-handers tend to be superior at this task. And it's this kind of obscure analytical logic test. So in one condition, he's saying the lefties are innately superior, they're better at this, and so on. In the other condition, he says the right-handers are. And he also added other bases of status discrimination between left and right-handers. So if the people were in the condition where they're being told that left-handers were better at the task, he also put up these signs around the lab that said stuff like, harassment of left-handers will not be tolerated, Don't give these left-handers, I mean, sure, they're really bad at this task, and we all know that they struggle to keep up in school, but just don't discriminate against them for the duration of the study. It's just not fair, and you'll just make them feel bad. And then in the other condition, he said all that stuff about right-handers. And what he found was that whichever group he stigmatized tended to score worse on the Raven progressive matrices task. So when the left-handers were stigmatized, when people were encouraged not to make fun of them or deny them access to the bathroom or whatever, when the left-handers were stigmatized, they tended to perform worse on this logic test. When the right-handers were stigmatized, they were the ones that performed worse on the task. And this gap was created purely by the stigmatization of a category that was previously unrelated to status. In fact, people probably came into the lab not just not knowing that there was some status differentiation attached to left versus right-handedness, but they probably thought the opposite. They probably came in thinking left and right-handers are equal. So even though this was totally unrelated to ability on the task, in reality, they were able to be convinced in about 30 minutes that it was a very real basis of discrimination on this this analytical task, and then it had real self-fulfilling effects in terms of people's performance on the task. And perhaps this is the process that produces the past findings we have on the racial test score gap. Are there any questions about Lavalia's research? Okay. Okay, so that's an interesting take. That's a very sociological take based on status research and concept and our theories of status. It's a very sociological take on why it is that there might be a racial gap in achievement on standardized tests. This is an example of status research from sociological social psychology on another basis of discrimination in society, or another pattern of discrimination or differential outcomes and inequality in society. And this is research that was on motherhood and the motherhood wage penalty. So is anybody familiar with the motherhood wage penalty? Okay, so the motherhood wage penalty is basically the following, and this is one of those things that often winds up on multiple choice tests anytime I define something. So motherhood wage penalty is the tendency of mothers to make less money relative to women without children and also relative to fathers. And this is a well-documented tendency in American culture as well as in other societies for mothers tend to be paid lower wages, passed over for promotion, and so on. And this is the case even when we sort of statistically analyze all these different things that might cause that, like stays outside the workforce to have children, women have children, and so on, men don't. Even when they do that, they still can't explain away the motherhood wage penalty. And so a lot of researchers say, maybe there's discrimination going on. Maybe people discriminate against mothers in the labor market, assuming that they're less competent or less committed to their jobs or what have you. And so that's where these researchers started. They said, well, you've got big data sets about the American labor market and other countries' labor markets. And in those data sets, you have a big difference in wages that are assigned to mothers versus non-mothers, or mothers versus fathers. And you don't have any measures of discrimination directly. You're just sort of assuming that discrimination must be responsible for this difference. And it might be. In fact, it's perhaps very plausible. But we don't have direct evidence for discrimination. And that's what would be needed to really substantiate that claim and make it stronger. So these researchers, Shelley Carell, Steve Bernard, and In Paik, in 2000, well, a few years before this is when it was published, decided at Cornell University to do research on this and try and show experimentally in a lab and then also in a real field setting, try and show strong, direct causal evidence for a motherhood wage gap. And I should say these people are all good friends of mine, actually, so that's part of why this is here. Steve and I were roommates for like a year. In's really cool. Shelley's a good friend of mine. Anyway, all right. So what they decided to do was set up a resume evaluation study. The first thing they decided to do was a lab experiment with undergraduate students at Cornell University. And what they called it was resume evaluation study. Come participate in a resume evaluation study. And when people got to the lab, they evaluated a series of resumes that were either the resumes of men or women who were parents or not. So they would evaluate, there were 4 conditions to the study. 2 manipulations, parenthood status and gender, creating 4 conditions. You're reading and evaluating resumes by people who are mothers, fathers, non-mothers, or non-fathers. And what they found was that mothers tended to be assigned lower wages, lower likelihood of promotion, even when their qualifications were established to be identical to the non-mothers and the fathers. Yeah. Okay. Long pause. Yeah. Okay. And another thing that they found was that fathers tended to receive a boost, actually. Now, this is very interesting, and I think interpretable maybe in terms of stereotypes, which we'll talk about starting next Thursday. They found not only that mothers made less money, even when everything was the same about them except that they had a kid, which was indicated via this little note that said that they were in the PTA. And in the other condition with their non-mothers, it said they were in some other voluntary association that wasn't associated with motherhood. And then the fathers In the condition where the fathers were indicated to be fathers relative to not being fathers, the fathers actually got a higher wage. They had a higher likelihood of promotion. They were treated more favorably as far as what sort of economic benefits they deserved, which is very interesting. And when they did what's called a mediation analysis to try and find out what are the underlying causes of the motherhood wage penalty, why is it the case that these mothers are being assigned lower wages and lower likelihood of promotion? What they found was that it was due to the fact that mothers relative to non-mothers were perceived to be less competent, less intelligent, and less committed to their jobs. And so there's kind of two pathways. One was a competence pathway to discrimination. The other one was a commitment pathway. And the commitment pathway was, when they would interview these people, they'd say, well, I just presume that she probably won't, be as available to do extra hours on the job. She probably won't work, these long hours. If she gets promoted to management, we need her to do 60 hours a week. She'll probably privilege her kid over that. But they didn't make the same assumptions about fathers. And then the other one, the one that's more surprising, though, is this competence path. I mean, what is it about having a kid that would make you less intelligent? I mean, that doesn't make any damn sense at all. But that's the case. And in other research, they found that, too, that a woman, an identical woman that has a pregnancy prosthesis on, will be viewed as less intelligent. And I've had friends, actually, who, when they got pregnant, they said that they thought people started talking to them like they were morons. Like, they would baby talk to them and stuff, and they'd be like, I'm the same person that I was last week. Like, what's going on? You're baby talking to me, But I think people, a lot of women who've had the experience, who are mothers, who've have had similar experiences can maybe chime in and relate. So then the big question is, why did fathers receive a boost? This is a very puzzling finding, right? And I think my take on this is that men are advantaged in the U.S. labor market. They're seen as higher status, they're assumed to be more competent, and so on. That's a gap that's closing, I think, but nonetheless, it's been the case. But there are also the stereotypical traits that we associate with men in our culture are not all positive, right? They may be seen as maybe a little bit reckless, a little bit risk-taking, maybe aggressive, ambitious, competitive, and so on, and maybe not the perfect hire. You take it all together, and yeah, they get favored in the labor market, but they're not perfect. But when that person becomes a father, then all of a sudden it negates a whole bunch of those negative characteristics. It flips them around. All of a sudden they become presumed to be reliable, dependable. They're not going to just run off to a better firm. They need that job. They become more honest, maybe less relentlessly competitive, and so on. Ward Cleaver type, that kind of thing. And wouldn't you like to hire Ward Cleaver? Wouldn't that be fun? You have no idea what I'm talking about. He's the father on Leave It to Beaver. Okay. So then they were like, okay, so this is cool. We've shown this effect very systematically in this undergraduate population of Cornell University undergraduates. And we told them that their decisions might have a real effect on who gets hired, which is really weird that they told them that, but they bought it. But they said, look, they got criticized for this research. The research was considered really strong evidence for the motherhood wage penalty and for the role of discrimination in the motherhood wage penalty. But nonetheless, people said, yeah, but that's not employers. Employers who are paid to get it right, paid to hire the smartest person, they're not going to do that. They will not exhibit the motherhood wage penalty because they've got to get it right. And so what Carell et al. Did, what Carell, Bernard, and Paik did, was an audit study. What's an audit study? An audit study is when you send out job applications or housing applications systematically and vary some characteristic in order to audit the agency or the job market, try and figure out if there's bias in it. And so they sent out job applications to white-collar jobs in New York City, and they manipulated the same manipulations. They manipulated gender and parenthood status. And the result was 4 conditions, right? Mothers, fathers, non-mothers, and non-fathers. And what they found was that mothers got fewer callbacks for interviews than did non-mothers or fathers. And they didn't find a statistically significant advantage for men on callbacks, but they did find actually that fathers got callbacks at a somewhat higher rate. It just wasn't statistically significant. And so this is strong evidence for the motherhood wage penalty in the real labor market, right? In the real United States labor market, it seems to be the case that those processes they found in the lab experiment are also true in the labor market. And this answers some of our concerns, at least in this case, it answers some of our concerns that maybe lab studies aren't real, that their data, that their findings won't be replicated in real world settings. Because here, almost the exact same pattern was found in the real world data.